Understanding Russia's influence in Africa has gained popularity in recent years, especially under President Vladimir Putin's leadership. Numerous political, economic, and military initiatives have defined Russia's involvement in Africa. Russia has sought to strengthen its alliances and partnerships with African countries. While the extent of these alliances may vary, there have been notable engagements between Russia and African leaders. Russia's role as a supplier of food and fertilizer to Africa has been a significant factor in its alliances. This brings us to our video of today. Does Putin's free grain for Africa come with a political price? We are going to be answering this question throughout this video. We will also be looking at how Africans are reacting to this free grain and what Traore plans on doing. Make sure you watch this video till the end to see how Russia is weaponizing hunger in Africa. The agricultural minister for Russia announced late on February 21 that Moscow had fulfilled President Vladimir Putin's July pledge to send 200,000 metric tons of free grain to 6 African nations. Agriculture Minister Dmitry Patrushev informed Putin during a meeting that Russia supplied 50,000 tons each to Somalia and the Central African Republic and 25,000 tons each to Mali, Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, and Eritrea. Putin had promised to deliver free grain to the 6 countries at a summit with African leaders in July, soon after Moscow withdrew from a deal that had allowed Ukraine to ship grain from its Black Sea ports, despite the war Russia has been waging. Putin announced he was going to give 25,000 to 50,000 tons of free grain over the next 3 to 4 months to 6 countries: Somalia, Burkina Faso, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, Central African Republic, and Mali. However, the Russian president did not mention allowing Ukraine to continue its grain exports through the Black Sea. The deal, known as the Black Sea Grain Initiative, had helped lower prices on the global market, but Putin argued it was failing to get supplies to the countries in most urgent need. Moscow's decision to pull out of the grain deal did not only hit Ukrainian exports, it also threatened to worsen a global food crisis exacerbated by the war. Patrushev told Putin that since the Russia-Africa Conference, Russia has been preserving ties and fostering collaboration with African nations. They were able to ship this amount of wheat to these different countries because of these relationships. He also told Putin that Russia expects to export up to 70 million metric tons of grain in the 2023 to 2024 agricultural year. In the previous season, Russia shipped 66 million tons worth, almost $16.5 billion. The 2023 to 2024 agricultural year started July 1, 2023, and lasts until June 30, 2024. Note that Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traore accused African leaders of beggary at the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg, Russia. Traore thanked Russian President Vladimir Putin for deciding to send free grain to African countries and expressed that Africa should become self-sufficient in food by the next summit. Ibrahim Traore deemed it desirable that they could produce themselves. Zimbabwean President Emerson Mnangagwa told the summit his country was food secure, but thanked his Russian counterpart nonetheless. The fact that Africa has become a net importer of food and agricultural products, despite its vast agricultural potential, is puzzling. Bear in mind that a people that can't feed itself is bound to fail. Africa is failing, and Russia might have seen the best means to get into Africa. At the rate at which things are going, if Russia is to have more conflicts with other countries, this only means one thing for Africa: hunger. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia has caused major disruptions to the world's food supply networks, with sub-Saharan African countries suffering the most, especially in countries that heavily rely on Ukrainian wheat, such as Libya, Kenya, Mauritania, and Eritrea. More than 100 million people in sub-Saharan Africa experienced severe food insecurity by the end of 2023. If the shocks are not dealt with, the region may experience social and political instability as well as increased poverty. African nations must change their extremely precarious and reliant food systems to protect themselves from such geopolitical outbursts. They must also seize the opportunities presented by intra-African agricultural commerce. Russia hopes to forge partnerships with African leaders and increase its political clout in the region by giving free grain to African nations. With this action, Russia may project credibility as a trustworthy partner and provider of food, particularly in light of the sanctions imposed by the West. It is worth mentioning that the countries receiving free grain are strategically chosen based on Russia's foreign policy priorities in Africa. While this initiative may be seen as a goodwill gesture, it is also a way for Russia to further its geopolitical interests and gain support from African nations. Africa has the potential to cultivate its own grain, and historically, some African countries have been able to produce enough food to meet their needs and even export surplus crops. For example, Zimbabwe was once considered the breadbasket of Africa and could feed the entire continent in the 1960s and 1970s. However, Africa faces various environmental challenges such as drought, erratic rainfall patterns, and soil degradation, which has affected agricultural productivity. Insufficient infrastructure, including transportation networks, storage facilities, and irrigation systems, has hindered agricultural development and limited the ability to produce and distribute food efficiently. Political instability, conflicts, and economic challenges have also impacted agricultural productivity in some African countries, making it difficult to achieve self-sufficiency in grain production. African countries need to step up and stop dwelling on these challenges. If they keep doing so, this therefore means they will always be expecting supplies from foreign countries. The economic crisis in Nigeria has reached an extreme. The escalating cost of food and skyrocketing inflation have infuriated Nigerians to a fever pitch. But who takes the blame for the mounting financial pain? The streets of Lagos are packed with angry demonstrators calling to end hardship now. Amid the West African country's worst economic crisis in more than 2 decades. There is the challenge of high inflation, and there's also the secondary issue of devaluation of the currency. Nigeria's government announced the setup of a board charged with regulating food prices and ordered the National Grain Reserve to distribute 42,000 tons of grain to poor and vulnerable Nigerians. The government plans to support rice producers to get more produce onto the market. Around 15 million poor households are receiving a cash transfer of 25,000 naira a month. This is not what the government should be doing, for this will just make more Nigerians lazy. This is a point where agriculture should have an impact in Nigeria. The statement, "Agriculture should be our next oil," was made abundantly evident in 2014 by Akinwumi Adesina, the Nigerian Minister of Agriculture and current head of the African Development Bank. However, African farmers and community leaders are not ready to see their lands and cultures destroyed in another wave of neocolonial plunder. There is growing pushback against the promotion of industrial farming in Africa. It is time to drop stubborn adherence to a failing agricultural dogma. It is time to protect the lands and livelihoods of small-scale farmers and end the sort of corporate-driven, top-down development that has failed so miserably. It is time to give African farmers a seat at the table, rather than excluding them from gatherings like the Africa Food Systems Forum. The estimated 784 million food-insecure Africans need to eat, and African farmers should know how to feed them. What does the African continent need to do to achieve greater food security and reduce reliance on imports? Expanding and improving irrigation infrastructure is crucial, especially in areas prone to drought. This will increase crop yields and provide a more reliable source of water. Investing in modern storage facilities helps to reduce post-harvest losses, preserving more food to reach consumers. Upgrading roads and transportation networks will ensure that produce move efficiently from farms to markets. Education and training programs will teach farmers modern techniques, pest management, and ways to increase yields sustainably. Lowering tariffs, simplifying customs regulations, and improving border processes will also ease the flow of agricultural goods between African countries. This helps stabilize regional food prices and creates a more integrated African market. It's funny how there are countries in Africa that export wheat to Western countries, while other African countries are importing from different countries. How does Africa progress with all this? Russia's grain supply is serving as soft bait to strengthen the established, long-standing ties with Africa and to win support for the unjustified conflict in Ukraine. This will happen until lasting food security is established through modernizing agriculture and providing enough support for local farmers. Africa has become a highly important arena. Russia is aiming to become Africa's go-to international ally over time. Despite this, African nations generally harbor goodwill for Russia, which is shown in their reluctance to voice criticism of the conflict that broke out in Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Eritrea voted against a UN General Assembly resolution calling for Russia to remove its soldiers from Ukraine, even though several others adopted a neutral stance. The Kremlin is steadily making inroads, taking advantage of instability in countries that used to rely on former colonial ties with Europe. The leaders of these countries have sharply denounced their previous colonial links, taken steps to sever connections with the West, particularly France, and have frequently promoted the myth that Russia never colonized African nations. It's important to note that millions of people have read and watched the articles in local and international media on Russia's humanitarian grain donation to the 6 African nations. Some media sites praised Russia in their headlines for feeding Africa, but they sadly neglected to consider the repercussions, such as these African nations' inability to develop their agriculture and instead rely on food packages. At least half of the continent of Africa imports wheat from Russia and Ukraine. In addition to wheat and grains, Russia is a great supplier of weapons and security support, primarily in return for mineral concessions and unrestricted access to natural resource deposits in Africa. There is no denying that Russian flags have spread throughout Africa as a legitimate representation of anti-Western sentiment. However, in actuality, it highlights the leaders of Africa's collective shortcomings, incapacity to focus on development priorities, flagrant mismanagement, and incompetence. To put it briefly, African leaders make empty promises about pursuing economic sovereignty. Africa has the second largest agricultural landmass in the world. Africa remains a significant economic market in the larger global context, despite this low concentration of wealth due to recent economic progress and the continent's youthful population. But why does Africa continue to be the least developed and poorest continent in the world and be scurrying about looking for food packages? Capital from investments and interesting loans has been stolen off and returned to Europe. Africa is currently in danger of going bankrupt, especially the sub-Saharan nations. Therefore, addressing food security is essential for an emerging Africa in the 21st century. Africa can only become a more powerful economic force in the face of intensifying geopolitics by addressing obstacles, seizing new opportunities, honing existing plans, and, most crucially, making extensive use of its own vast natural and human resources. It's time to put an end to Africa's imaginative European circus. Africa needs to do better. Do you think that Russia sending grain to Africa is a trap? Let us know what you think in the comments. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the New Tourist channel. Turn on notifications too so you get notified whenever we upload videos like this. Thanks for watching and see you in our next video.